Good morning. My name is Gordon Levine. I'm the Continuum of Care Manager with the Louisiana Housing Corporation. I manage the Louisiana Balance of State Continuum of Care, which is the largest coalition to end homelessness in Louisiana. We cover, among other areas, the Baton Rouge area, the Houma Terrebonne area, the Lake Charles area, all of their surrounding parishes, and several outlying parishes, including Natchitoches, Sabine, Plaquemines, and St. Bernard. I will be presenting second today.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I'm Tamisha T.J. Beeman. I'm the Deputy Director for Disaster Recovery Housing for Louisiana Housing Corporation. I will be presenting to you this morning about the U.S. Treasury Emergency Rental Assistance Program.
Okay, I think we're ready to go through slides.
The Emergency Rental Assistance Program. Could you go back to the first slide, the emergency assistance? Okay. The Emergency Rental Assistance Program objectives is to keep people housed during the pandemic by preventing evictions for failure to pay rent, to serve the maximum number of households as quick as possible while prioritizing the applicants with the greatest need. Priority will be placed on the applicants who previously applied to the Louisiana Emergency Rental Assistance Program, LERAP. Next slide, please. Program information. Eligible households are defined as households that at least one or more individual meets the following criteria: qualify for unemployment or has experienced a reduction in household income, are at risk of experiencing homelessness or housing instability, has a household income at or below 80% of the area median income. Next slide. Eligibility. All applicants will be screened for duplication of federal benefits. Eligible applicants who have been unemployed for 90 days prior to the application submission for assistance, household incomes of 80% below the area median income requirements will be prioritized for assistance. Qualifying household incomes is calculated based on the fiscal year 2020 earnings. The monthly household income at the time of application submission will be used as a verifying reference. Next slide. Assistance. Past due rental assistance for eligible households can receive up to 12 months of assistance retroactive to April 1st of 2020. Forward rental assistance can be provided for additional 3 months period contingent upon the availability of funds when deemed necessary. Next slide. Application process. Applicants or the landlord can apply on behalf, the landlord can apply on behalf of the tenant. If the landlord opts out of participating in the program, the tenant will receive a lump sum payment to cover the rental costs. All applicants and landlords can apply online at lastaterent.com. You can also dial the 1-877-459-6555 telephone number and apply online Monday through Friday between the hours of 8 to 5 p.m. Next slide. This is a recap of the tenant and landlord requirements. Tenants may be eligible for rental assistance under the program if the following requirements are met. Tenants reside in a rental unit within a parish covered by the program. At least one individual in the household qualify for unemployment benefits or experience a reduction in household income, incurred significant costs, or express other financial hardship due directly or indirectly to COVID-19. Tenant has received a past due rent notice, past due utility notice, or eviction notice, or is experienced housing instability. Housing income does not exceed the 80% area median limit of AMI for the parish as defined by the Department of Housing and Urban Development HUD. Landlords. Landlords may also apply on behalf of their tenants and will be required to accept the following conditions to receive payment under the program, forgive late fees, penalties, interest, and not charge for court costs occurred during the period for which rent arrears assistance is received or prior to April 2020. Not evict a tenant for past due rent prior to the April 2020. Not evict a tenant for at least 60 days after assistance in unless eviction is for cause other than non-payment of rent. Each tenant will be required that lives in the 57 parishes that we serve to provide income documentation, demonstration of housing instability or risk of homelessness, demonstration of financial hardship due to COVID-19. The landlords will also be required to submit documentation, proof of ownership, taxpayer ID, identity verification, and lease documentation. The landlord or the tenant can provide the lease to verify that the tenant is residing in the unit. Next slide. Any questions? And that would end my presentation on the emergency rental program. Gordon.
Sure. Thank you, TJ. So I want to take just a moment and highlight that although I'm going to be presenting on access to the homeless services system, which is both relevant to our recent disasters in general and to our current situation in relation to COVID-19, I want to highlight for a moment that the program that TJ presented on and other local Treasury dollar funded programs in general are in many ways our most powerful tool in Louisiana right now for preventing and ending homelessness. We've seen a lot of success both in the areas that LHC covers and in the areas that are locally administered like Baton Rouge, where folks are moving toward remaining stabilized in their housing. And so as a person who works not just on the stakeholder development side of homelessness prevention, but also as someone who is an advocate for preventing and ending homelessness, I strongly encourage you, if you are a person who is at risk of experiencing homelessness, or if you work with clients or participants who are in that situation, to make this information available to them, because it really is one of the most stunning examples in a very good way of federal support that I have seen in my lifetime and in my career of homeless services. So I'm going to dip into my presentation, but I wanted to make sure that I put that plug out there, that's a great resource. If you are even potentially in need, I encourage you to apply. Next slide, please.
Before we go to the next slide, are the panelists able to see the questions that come through in the chat or in the question and answer portion?
Yes, we are.
Okay.
So I do see a question there from one of our attendees. Will LHC provide attendees a copy of this PowerPoint presentation? I think, Michael, the question is are you folks in a position to distribute the PowerPoint? If so, I'm sure we're comfortable with it being distributed.
Okay. All right. Then yes, Vincent, we'll figure out a way to probably put it with the links as far as the recordings and things like that. We'll get it out to you somehow.
Very good. Thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you for that question. Okay, so let's bump ahead just a bit. Thank you, Michael, for handling the slide deck. I know it's always a little sort of when do you want the person to advance? So I appreciate your help there. So before I talk about the mechanisms for access for resources for people experiencing homelessness in Louisiana and what we're able to do, and I want to highlight that I'm going to say a lot, but at the end of the day, the mechanisms of access are very simple. I do want to put our statewide homeless response in context for y'all. So homelessness in Louisiana is really a story of great success, especially over the last decade. There are not many places in the country that can say that between 2011 and the end of the 2010s, they saw a nearly 70% decline in homelessness, which is an incredible gain. It's due to a number of different factors, but primarily it's a legacy of our relative wealth of permanent housing resources. So let me say that in a slightly different way. In Louisiana, we have a relatively large quantity of permanent housing subsidies that are dedicated to people experiencing homelessness. And that's primarily a legacy of funding that was made available to Louisiana in response to natural disasters over the last 2 decades through the federal government, for which we're very grateful. I think we all regret that we needed it, but one of the consequences of that has been that Louisiana has recovered in a really significant way for the impacts of those natural disasters. We have short-term vouchers, which we'll talk about later. We have longer-term vouchers for people who are experiencing chronic homelessness. And we have a network of emergency shelter that is available. And so regardless of where you are in your experience of homelessness, and I'm going to extemporize just about what that means in just a moment, but regardless of where you are in that process, it's likely that there is a local resource available that will be able to help you either where you are today or that will get you on the road to receiving the help that you need in short order. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about what homelessness means and the definitions that we're using, as well as who qualifies for assistance. So homelessness, I think in general, we think of it pretty narrowly, right? Homelessness is a person who is living in their car. Homelessness is a person who is living in an encampment in the woods. But the definition that we use, which is the definition put out by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, is broader than that in some ways, and it's also more specific. And we really divide it into 2 separate categories: people who are experiencing literal homelessness and people who are fleeing domestic violence. I want to add that there is a third applicable category: people who are at risk of experiencing homelessness. And for people who are in that situation, which means that you are imminently at risk of losing your existing housing within the next 14 days, it's a good general definition. Anyone who meets those criteria, they're very likely to qualify for the program that TJ just talked about. And so I won't be addressing that today, but if you are in a position where you are imminently at risk of losing homelessness, the program that TJ just presented on is really your port of call for that. In terms of people who are experiencing literal homelessness, in general, it means someone who slept last night in an emergency shelter, which could be a disaster shelter, or it could be a shelter that's designated for people experiencing homelessness. So in Baton Rouge, for example, which is my largest catchment area, that would be, for example, this is not an all-inclusive list, St. Vincent de Paul's Bishop Ott Shelter, Salvation Army's shelter, St. Agnes runs a shelter, and as we'll see in a minute, Iris runs a domestic violence shelter. But for people experiencing literal homelessness, you either slept last night in an emergency shelter or in another place not meant for human habitation. And not meant for human habitation can mean a lot of different things. I think in many different places in the country, it primarily means you slept on the streets, or you slept in your car, or you slept in the woods, or you slept under an overpass. But it also means that you slept in a building that would not pass code for habitability. So it doesn't have access to running water. It doesn't have access to electricity. It can't maintain its temperature in an appropriate way. And so there are other things that unfortunately in Louisiana are often the consequence of natural disasters, which would qualify a person as experiencing literal homelessness, even if they are physically sleeping in, or they slept last night in a building or in a structure that at one point may have been meant for human habitation, but no longer qualifies under that definition. The literal homelessness definition also includes people who are currently living in an institution, and they've been living in that institution for 90 or fewer days, and they entered that institution from one of the situations above. And so that's a pretty narrow window to slip through. But what it's designed to do is it's designed to say, look, if you have been in the hospital for a week, or you've been in a mental institution for a couple of weeks, or if you were in jail briefly, that those institutional stays, if you were experiencing homelessness before you went into that institution, that those institutional stays shouldn't disrupt your eligibility to qualify for assistance. But generally speaking, when we talk about literal homelessness, we're talking about you slept somewhere that wasn't a house, an apartment, a condo, in any place that people usually live. On the other hand of this, we have the definition of people fleeing domestic violence. And this definition is extremely broad. And I would say really beneficially broad, because HUD, I think, has worked very acutely with domestic violence activists and domestic violence interest groups, including the Department of Justice, on crafting a definition that is as inclusive as it possibly can to ensure that people are served to the extent that they are. And so I'm going to hit on some of the areas that it covers, but I want to say that in general, if a thing could, in theory, be included under the definition of domestic violence, there is a good chance that that it is a qualifying condition for services. So in general, domestic violence means that you have left, or you're trying to leave, or you would like to leave a domestic violence situation, and you have nowhere else to go when you leave. Right. And so that includes someone who is currently living in who has left a situation with their family in which domestic violence is present, someone who is the victim of sexual violence, of dating violence, of stalking, of human trafficking, which includes but is not limited to sex trafficking. And there are additional classifications that go beyond what we would think of as traditional violence, that are most clearly extending into youth domestic violence that apply to people who are aged 24 and under. And again, I want to like not get bogged down too much in definitions here, but I'm highlighting all of these to say that if you're in a position where this might in theory apply, please do seek help, as the assistance may very well be there for you. Next slide, please. We did just hit imminent homelessness. I would only highlight from the slide that I didn't pick up earlier that other than emergency rental assistance through the COVID-19 relief funds and through Treasury dollars, when people at imminent risk of homelessness contact a coordinated entry access point, so a unified point where people experiencing homelessness or who are at risk can request services. The primary benefit available to them, which is also the primary benefit available to people who are experiencing literal homelessness or fleeing domestic violence, is case management. And when we really moved to this model in Louisiana of saying that case management was a professional service that's delivered as a solution to homelessness based on national best practices and data locally, what we found is that having someone on the end to catch you when you ask for help was effective at least 50% of the time in returning someone to housing immediately that night with no public subsidy. And I would say returning to housing doesn't just mean we sent you back wherever you were, regardless of its situation. What it means is that for roughly half of the households that come through the door of our coordinated entry system in any part of the state, coordinated entry is boiled down, it means you can go to any one of a number of locations and receive access to all of the resources in your community. Anyone who comes through the door, they've got a 1 in 2 shot of being back in their home that night or very soon afterward due to the case management and mediation that you'll receive. And that's a great thing, both from a systems perspective, but also from a human perspective. As one of the things that we know as homeless services activists and also homeless services advocates, is fundamentally that applying for benefits is exhausting. And so we really want to return you to housing as much under your own steam as you possibly can while making sure that you have the resources that you need. Next slide. So generally speaking, we have really 3 resources beyond case management that we can provide you with. So if you imagine that you're a person experiencing homelessness, under any of the definitions that we explained, you go to one of the many organizations that I'm going to talk about in a little while and say, hi, I'm experiencing homelessness. What can you do for me? You do your case management bit. They try and mediate you back to your housing with your friends, with your family, with your support networks under your own steam. And that's not immediately functional. This is the slate of resources, generally speaking, that you're going to get access to. Emergency shelter, which is an answer to what do I do tonight, right? Tonight, we have a bed for you at the Bishop Ott shelter, right? Or at Salvation Army, or at St. Agnes, or, right? And we will have case management for you in the morning to help work you back to housing. Longer term, and the route to this depends on where you are in the state. I'm not going to get into those intricacies, but generally speaking, there is a route to this regardless of where you live. You'll be connected, assuming you are unable to return under your own steam, to either rapid rehousing, which is medium-term, short to medium-term rental assistance. It can range from anywhere from 3 months to 24 months at the very outside of a public subsidy, a voucher effectively, that you can carry with you to a unit of your choice, plus the case management designed to stabilize there, or permanent supportive housing, which is long-term rental assistance, starts at 12 months, goes longer than that if you need it. It provides case management. It usually provides wraparound services to address severe and persistent disabilities, but it's restricted to people who are experiencing at least 1 year of homelessness, which we refer to as chronic homelessness, and are living in a household with a severe and persistent disability. Next slide, please. So emergency shelter, let's do a little deeper dive on these resources. So shelter provides immediate and low barrier accommodations. It's really an answer to the question of, if I don't have anywhere to go tonight, where am I going to sleep? Usually it's semi-congregate or dormitory style. Family rooms might be available depending where you are in the state. I know I keep saying Baton Rouge. It's because it's the area of the state for which I'm responsible and where most of our resources are concentrated in my catchment area. We have some family rooms, we have some congregate rooms, we have some dormitory style rooms. It really is going to depend on what's available locally. But in general, emergency shelter is a big step up from experiencing unsheltered homelessness, but it is not as comfortable as, for example, renting your own unit. Shelters in general often provide food and other necessities like clothes and laundry, and all of those sort of what I would think of as like bottom of the pyramid necessity items to keep you going from day to day while you seek longer term accommodations. In addition to which, shelters almost always provide case management to help people experiencing homelessness navigate their next steps, whether that's returning to their previous housing option or whether that's applying for assistance through Section 8, through your local housing authority, or through the homeless dedicated resources, and there's a bunch of those. But ultimately, there will be somebody, or there's very likely to be somebody on the receiving end to help you navigate those applications. As one of the things that we recognize is that if you're experiencing homelessness, right, if you have, if things in your life have taken you to a place where an emergency shelter is the correct place for you to be, right, is your best option tonight, you're not going to be in a position where you're really going to want or have a lot of capacity to navigate a resources system. So we're going to do as much of that for you as we can. Shelter is available in every major urban area in Louisiana and in some rural areas, but need in every area of Louisiana exceeds demand. What that means is that we cannot guarantee you that there is an emergency shelter bed available for you if you tonight happen to be experiencing homelessness. There is turnover in every shelter that I know of, at least. They tend to operate at roughly 100% capacity, but that's with some amount of turnover every day. And so it's important to continue advocating, even if there's not a bed available tonight, there might be one tomorrow night, All shelters have their own intake procedures, and so I can't provide general guidance on how to get in, but in general, low barrier means you show up and you say, this is my situation, and they say yes or no, we don't have a bed. And ultimately, if you are in a position, or if your participants or clients are in the position, and I mentioned that because I see many service providers who are on the call today, if you're in a position, or if someone you're serving is in a position to need a shelter bed, the best advice that I can give you is to arrange it early in the day rather than later in the day to take advantage of whatever availability there might be. Next slide, please. So rapid rehousing, as I said, is short to medium term rental assistance, anywhere between 3 and 24 months, and that's down to individual project design, plus case management. Rapid rehousing is always scattered site and always participant choice. Meaning, if you are in a rapid rehousing project, if you're receiving a rapid rehousing voucher, it's a voucher that you can take to any unit that's available on the free market, right? And rent a unit that you find that meets HUD's housing quality standards, or HQS, which is a minimal inhabitants standard to ensure that whatever unit you're looking at is safe, sanitary, and secure. It's a minimal standard. It's not a zero standard. And so anything that you rent with a rapid rehousing voucher, and this is also going to be true for permanent supportive housing, we cannot guarantee that it will be the Ritz. I think the nicest unit that I've ever seen rented with a rapid rehousing voucher was a 4-bedroom single family home with a vaulted ceiling living room and a working fireplace. We can't guarantee that that's what you're going to get, but it will be safe, sanitary, secure, and adequate space-wise to the family that's applying for it. In addition, and this is not universally true, but it's generally true, if you receive a rapid rehousing voucher, you will usually have a case manager who will help you look for units, negotiate with the landlord, set up your lease, figure out cost, et cetera, et cetera. Rapid rehousing usually requires you to pay a portion of the rent. This again is project specific. There's no universal guidance on this, but in general, in very general terms, the project model that we usually see is that rapid rehousing requires participants to pay a percentage of the rent, and that percentage will increase over time, often in proportion to the participants' income increase. And so many rapid projects that I know of require you to pay 0% of your income in your first month. And at the 3-month mark, you might have an assessment that says, okay, this is what your income situation is. And so we're going to start requiring you to pay 15 or 30% of your income. And the goal is ultimately to get you to the point where you're paying 100% of the income, 100% of the rent, and that your income supports that. Right. So that ultimately the subsidy will withdraw and you'll be left in a position where you can self-sufficiently afford your unit. Rapid rehousing doesn't usually provide food or other necessities like clothes or laundry in the way that we discussed from emergency shelter, though it may provide for referrals to places that do provide those. It may also provide furniture. Furniture is kind of the big secondary benefit that many rapid rehousing projects provide, because we know if you're in a position to enter a rapid project, you're probably not in a position to furnish it yourself, certainly not immediately. Rapid rehousing programs are available in every area of Louisiana. But almost all rapid rehousing is accessed through the local coordinated entry system, which I will touch on again later. Remember, that's your local single point of access to all resources available. Rapid rehousing is also not an overnight fix. This is also true for PSH. So emergency shelter is something that you can do when at 11 a.m., I know that I'm not going to have anywhere to sleep tonight. I go look for emergency shelter. They'll arrange a bed for me tonight. That's what emergency shelter is for. Rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing, generally speaking, do not work that way. It is exceedingly rare to go from 11 a.m., I don't know what I'm doing tonight, to tonight I am sleeping in a unit that was rented with a rapid voucher or permanent supportive housing voucher. It's it's so rare that I would say that it's not going to happen. Most local continuums of care, which are your local organizing stakeholder group of homeless services providers, have a process that they require you to go through before you are prioritized or you're added to the local prioritization list for resources. That process is going to look differently depending on whether you live in Hammond or Baton Rouge or Lake Charles or New Orleans or Alexandria or Monroe or Shreveport or anywhere else. But in general, they all incorporate the at first presentation, there's going to be some case management to try to return you to housing. There's going to be a period of time in the middle where you do some level of assessment to determine your level of need. And unfortunately, while every instance of homelessness is a tragedy, and every instance of homelessness is an extremely acute need in relation to the general population, we are also aware that within experiences of homelessness, there are different levels of need, and some of them are much more acute than others. And resources, generally speaking, are prioritized to those with the most acute needs. And so there is going to be a period of time between when you apply or when you first present for services, first ask for services, and when you're prioritized, when you're added to the prioritization list, which is not first come, first serve in any jurisdiction that I know of, and when you receive a voucher. And ultimately, whether that process is overnight or not, whether that process is this week or this month or not, is going to be a significantly a function of your level of need within what we all know is a level of acute need. And ultimately, the reason for that is that our need, even though we are relatively wealthy locally in terms of subsidies and have been able to make significant progress in ending homelessness, even though all those things are true, we are still in a situation where we do not have adequate resources to end homelessness or to house people immediately, or et cetera. And so as you go through this, one of the things that I would caution to you or to your clients, depending on your situation, is that while emergency shelter is an immediate fix, longer-term vouchers are not. And your most likely way of getting back to housing quickly is, again, to turn to your support networks, your friends, your family, your faith networks, and your own resources. Next slide. Thank you. Permanent supportive housing, as I said earlier, is longer-term rental assistance. It starts at 12 months. It is, generally speaking, open-ended, right? It's discontinued at the participant's interest. I think the last time I checked, the average length of stay in a permanent supportive housing project was around 5 years. And that's fundamentally because permanent supportive housing is restricted to people experiencing chronic homelessness and who are living with a severe and persistent disability that impacts their capacity to live self-sufficiently and independently. And so it's really a long-term intervention for people who have one version and a very prominent version of the most acute need that we see in our homeless populations. Some permanent supportive housing projects are scattered site, just like rapid rehousing. You get a voucher, you find your unit, you rent it. Some of it is single site, which means that you have a single location that operates often like an apartment complex where you're living with other people who are also in the site, even though you have your own private living quarters. And so PSH, there are other ways that permanent supportive housing can look as well, but that's generally the way it tends to look. And so permanent supportive housing, I think, it really runs the gamut. And again, this is down to local project design, but it runs the gamut, everything from this like very independent, help you find your own apartment, rapid rehousing style voucher program that looks a lot like Section 8, for example, all the way down to this, all the way down to what is a sober living situation, for example, that's very similar to a single site facility, or is a single site facility, where people that are there because they're experiencing chronic homelessness and living with a severe and persistent disability, and they have a co-occurring substance abuse disorder, which, as we know, is unfortunately prevalent in our homeless populations. PSH projects, their rent situation or rent contribution is set up generally very differently than rapid rehousing. Rapid rehousing assumes that within 24 months, usually within 12 months, average length of stay is 6 months, you'll be in a position to take over paying rent yourself, right? Because you're back on your feet, you've got some level of income, you're in a good situation, you're able to live self-sufficiently. And people do exit rapid generally more than 90% of the time, project by project, to permanent housing, which they maintain. PSH, because it's open-ended, because it's for people with very high acuity, generally speaking, permanent supportive housing projects require participants to pay a flat 30% of whatever their current income is toward rent. And that percentage basically doesn't change. A person's income might, but their percentage might. And so if a participant has zero income in a permanent supportive housing project, generally speaking, they can assume that they're going to be paying $0 toward their unit's total rent. And when I say rent, by the way, I'm including the total cost of the unit, which means rent and utilities. For many people who are living in PSH, their primary income source is going to be SSI, SSDI, right? Social Security, disability income, or supplemental. I always get my SSI acronym mixed up, but you're receiving some level of periodic monthly income that is not employment income. And so it'll be 30% of your monthly benefit, which is somewhere between $900 and $1,200 for most households. Case managers will work with you to secure that income if you're not already receiving it. Just like rapid rehousing, scattered site PSH doesn't usually provide food and other necessities. Single site permanent supportive housing might or might not provide some of the same accommodations that emergency shelter does, like food, clothing, laundry, on-site medication management, and so on and so on and so on. It really depends on the project. Like Rapid, PSH is available in every area of Louisiana, but again, it's accessed through the local coordinated entry system. And again, it's not an overnight fix. Next slide, please. So coordinated entry. I could do 3 hours on coordinated entry, and I guarantee that there are 0 people in the audience or watching this slide later that want to hear that. And so I'm going to try and do it in 2 minutes instead. Coordinated entry is a solution that emerged and was eventually picked up by HUD and recommended, and eventually picked up by HUD and mandated. A solution to a very long-term problem. And the problem is I'm experiencing homelessness, or I don't know where I'm going to sleep tonight, or I'm fleeing domestic violence, or any iteration of that. It's 11 a.m. What am I going to do about tonight? And how am I going to figure out what all of the resources are that I have access to? And when I do this presentation in front of live groups, I usually say, okay, so who in the audience can tell me what you would do in this situation? And I get like every different kind of answer. I think my favorite was I go to my local gas station and I ask if they know about anything, which is actually a pretty good strategy because I've often heard retail outlets like that provide really good information and really acute information about, like, I know so-and-so and I referred them to here and it was quite successful. But I go to my local gas station, or more commonly, like I ask my local St. Vincent de Paul affiliate, or I ask my local Catholic Charities, or my local religious association, or my local United Way for help. All of those historically have given you a piece of the pie, but they've, generally speaking, referred you to whatever resources they have in-house, and then whatever they happen to know about, that case manager happens to know about in the broader community. Coordinated entry was originally an idea and then a recommendation, and is now a requirement that says every continuum of care, remember, local stakeholder group of homeless services providers and associates, has to have a system by which it designates one or more points of single access where a person experiencing homelessness can present to and say, hi, I don't know where I'm sleeping tonight. What am I supposed to do? And they'll receive access to everything, right? Especially permanent housing resources, so that you can be confident when you go to that Salvation Army or Catholic Charities or United Way or Community Action Agency or wherever, that they're going to direct you to everything and help you get access to everything. Everywhere in Louisiana has a coordinated entry system. Every parish, every place in Louisiana has access to a coordinated entry system. It's operated by one of 7 continuums of care in Louisiana. Generally speaking, they make available both phone and walk-in options. Those options are going to vary between parish, they're going to vary between COC, but we keep a live registry of that. There's going to be a link to that registry at the end of this PowerPoint. Coordinated entry usually provides 3 basic interventions: case management to help you return to housing, like we discussed earlier, referrals to homelessness prevention activities when it's available, and that includes the presentation TJ just made, and access to the housing prioritization list, which generally speaking is how rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing are accessed. Next slide, please. So accessing coordinated entry. The Louisiana Balance of State Continuum of Care, which is the largest COC in Louisiana, which I manage, maintains a list of all of the coordinated entry access points in Louisiana on its website. It's linked right on the slide. You just click there. You can distribute this to your participants. You can distribute it in any way that you want. It's publicly available information. We want it out there as much as possible. It is easy to navigate for people with different capacities. There is a map there. You can just click your parish and it will tell you exactly what's available there. There's also a written list of what's available. And finally, you can pull up just a big list of everything that's available in all of Louisiana. We've really tried to make it as accessible as we possibly can. And we're continuing to work on different mechanisms of accessibility to address accessibility for people who are experiencing partial vision loss, hearing loss, and people whose primary language is not English. In many areas, I would add also, in many areas of the state, 211 will also help connect you with your coordinated entry, your local coordinated entry providers, but that's not true in all of Louisiana. And so we really recommend that you hit up that website if you are able to do so, or if you're able to do so for your clients to connect them with their resources. That said, if all else fails, 211 is always a good first stop too.